I'm Brad Barham, a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I teach on economic and environmental issues. In the last video, we introduced the main players in the grand bargain process for the Colorado River Basin. This video explores what's likely to happen in the month ahead with respect to the major water cuts called for in 2023, as well as the upcoming negotiations on the post-2026 Colorado River Management Guidelines. It really depends on which approaches the parties bring to the table, whether they are able and willing to make meaningful sacrifices to reach a more painful grand bargain than they have ever reached before. A likely starting point for conversation is making proportional cuts based on the hydrology of the river. Put differently, if the overall cuts are 20%, then a simple share rule would have all states taking a proportional cut of 20%. We close by noting that nothing may happen with the grand bargain until the Bureau of Reclamation or the Assistant Secretary of the Interior announce the cuts they intend to impose. Continued inaction is definitely not an option. That would increase the likelihood of a full-blown crisis at the reservoirs that could result in the loss of hydroelectric power generation and water delivery to the 7 states.
We start with an obvious observation. There are two deliberative processes, and they are deeply intertwined. For sure, the magnitude of the 2023 cuts will shape changes in water use in the Colorado River Basin in unprecedented ways that will deeply influence long-term guidelines for management. Second, the principles and politics that guide these cuts will set the tone for the post-2026 guideline discussions. Before we discuss likely next steps, it helps to remind ourselves about the concept of a grand bargain. It is an optimistic term coined in the past 2 decades by 2 Colorado River policy vets, John Fleck and Eric Kuhn.
Just 10 years ago, in a major study by the federal government, states forced the modelers to add so-called magic water, extra water that existed in the computer model only, which is just absurd.
You can see John and Eric on stage together in a panel of last summer's annual conference on the Colorado River. The title of that University Colorado conference was, tellingly, 2026 may be too late. Hard conversations about really complicated issues. Their core idea is that each basin or participant gives up politically treasured but practically unrealistic interpretations of the law of the river to avoid litigation, allow for timely and necessary adjustments, and provide more certainty for water management communities. From the last video, this might mean, for example, that the big dogs with present perfected rights to water recognize that if the feds can't continue to deliver water through the system, then their rights become literally a large share of nothing. So even the big dogs come to the grand bargain discussion ready to avoid a legal fight that avoids wrangling until the river runs dry. At the same time, there are no easy answers to how the grand bargain plays out. Why? Because Colorado River decision makers have different levels of power based on size, for example, cities, and senior rights to water. And as we saw, there are lots of decision makers in the mix. Also, there will be lots of exchanges and deals that can be made on the side between decision makers. All of this means that the most certain statement that can be made about what will happen on the Colorado River is the favorite mantra of humble economists: nobody knows. It really depends also on what approaches the parties bring to the table, whether they are able and willing to make meaningful sacrifices to reach a more painful grand bargain than they have ever reached before. That said, we can readily point to, pardon the pun, a central pivot of the grand bargain drama. Agriculture uses most of the river's water, let's say 75%. Farmers have the most senior rights to Colorado River water, and farming water cuts are absolutely essential given the 16 to 33% cut planned for 2023 and beyond by the Bureau of Reclamation. You can't get to, say, a 25% cut without serious reductions from agriculture, probably based on rotational fallowing of farmland. You'd have to move 20 to 40 million people to leave agriculture whole, no cuts in water use. That's a non-starter. There's no fallowing cities. At the same time, a large reduction in agricultural water use is only likely to happen if both farmers and surrounding communities are compensated for fallowing land and are allowed the flexibility to manage tough water use decisions locally. The good news is A recent $4 billion allocation from the Inflation Control Act makes this compensation possible.
So this legislation is going to allow us to help provide some compensation in the short term to farmers who may have to have their fields go fallow for a short period of time.
How long is a short period of time is not clear, but by providing a financial backstop, it will give science an opportunity, she says, to catch up.
Our job is to think of creative, new, innovative ways to reuse water, to be efficient with water, and new ways to engage in farming to keep those yields while using less water.
The bad news so far, at least, is that the kinds of compensation figures being discussed by the federal government, farmers, and irrigation districts may not match up. For example, the Biden administration recently proposed the following payment scheme for fallowing farmland and voluntarily cutting back on water use. A one-year agreement will pay $330 per acre foot, a two-year agreement will pay $365 per acre foot, and a three-year agreement will pay $400 per acre foot. Meanwhile, we have heard that the Imperial Valley Farm Bureau was calling for $1,200 per acre foot for fallowing land, while the Imperial Irrigation District may have been suggesting figures more like $600 to $800 per acre foot. Now that's a pretty big gap to close, somewhere between 4 to 1 and 2 to 1. And who knows now what's going on behind closed doors at the time for completing a 2023 deal is close to running out. Another important question is whether the cuts will be shared in an equitable manner across farming regions in the basin, and what does equitable even mean for tribes who are just starting to develop their enterprises based on recent water settlements. We might want to ask the Ute Mountain Ute, who the past 2 years have dealt with 75 to 80% cuts in water for their reservation, what's fair.
The water is flowing and the crops are growing at the Ute Mountain Ute Indian Reservation in Toyac, Colorado. But this year, only a fraction of this tribal farm is green. After 2 straight winters with well below average snowpack, 75% of their water supply has been cut.
So this year, out of the 7,600 acres, we're dealing with 6,000 acres of weed-infested ground.
Simon Martinez says when the Ute Mountain farm is fully planted, he can employ more than 60 people, most of which are tribal members. But with mostly barren fields in 2022, he had to let half of his workers go.
Another central pivot of the Grand Bargain drama is how the 7 states will balance cuts across the 2 basins. To be clear, the 1922 Compact and subsequent additions to the Law of the River put the allocation across the upper and lower basin and the 7 states as follows: 7.5 million acre feet for lower and upper basins, with Mexico getting 1.5 million acre feet. If water levels are less than 16.5 million acre feet in the river, which they've now been for quite some time, then by law the lower basin is supposed to get its 7.5 million acre feet before everyone else based on having senior rights to the river. The lower basin uses more water and has more senior rights, remember IID, the Imperial Irrigation District, Yuma, and the Met, along with others. The upper basin is a source of the water, and they've made cuts over the past few years. They would say it's the lower basin's turn to help out. That approach probably won't work, as Zachary Frankel and Colby Pellegrino say. The instability comes from the intransigence shown so far on all sides to take meaningful cuts. Sustaining the Grand Bargain really depends on which approaches the parties bring to the table, whether they are able and willing to make meaningful sacrifices to reach a more painful Grand Bargain than they have ever reached before. A likely starting point for conversation is making proportional cuts relative to the hydrology of the river. In other words, if the overall cuts needed are, say, 20%, then a simple share rule would have all states take a proportional cut of 20%. I say starting point because from there, one could move from trades and exchanges, and that's our third central pivot. Will participants be willing to change the rules of the game, the so-called Law of the River rules related to interstate transfers, inter-user transfers, rights to provide water back to the system for proper compensation, and so forth? An example would be allowing tribes to lease rights to water to other parties to help ease constraints, or to trade water rights in one state for access to water in another. Those transfers could help to make hard conservation choices in one locale a bit easier by allowing water rights from another place to be purchased temporarily or more permanently at returns that make it worthwhile for conservation to occur where it's not as difficult. In the past, there has been hesitation to change these rules. Could doing so move water valuation more quickly to higher valued uses, including reduction in use and saving the environment? We close by noting that nothing may happen with the Grand Bargain until the Bureau of Reclamation or the Assistant Secretary of the Interior announce the cuts they intend to impose.
The Bureau of Reclamation has only limited authority over water administration in the West, and that was the way it was set up from its beginning in 1902. Congress made it really clear that reclamation wouldn't interfere with state laws governing the use of water. So the federal government's ability to act unilaterally is really constrained. That doesn't mean that it can't act at all. And reclamation officials have made it clear that they intend to take action that's necessary to protect the infrastructure of the federal dams and water projects that exist throughout the Colorado River Basin. They would much prefer to have the states and tribes and major stakeholders come to an agreement about how to manage the system. But if that doesn't happen, Interior is preparing right now to take the reins.
We're expecting that after an announcement like that, there's going to be a flurry of last-minute negotiations and possible exchanges between the states and various stakeholders. That could lead to a compromise. How much of a compromise may depend on what kind of exchanges are allowed. In any event, continued inaction is definitely not an option. That would increase the likelihood of a full-blown crisis at the reservoirs that in 2023 or 2024 could result in the loss of hydroelectric power generation potential and water delivery to the states.